Greetings, everyone. This is Virtuous Roots, where we cultivate virtue to bring it to our home and yours. And I'm Thomas McCuddy.
I'm Thomas Quackenbush.
And I'm Nick Wiegand. And today's conversation, basically, I just got a prompt today. Thomas gave me just a prompt, and it's the idea of the difference of discipline versus punishment in the home. And he started to talk about it, and I wanted to stop him because I find this interesting. First off, that he's going to draw a clear delineation between the two. I'm making the assumption. And this is a conversation that happens in my family quite a bit at the moment because we have young young kids around. My kids have kids, so I have young grandbabies around. And here at the church, we have a bunch of young children, and with a bunch of young children comes behavioral problems, every now and then or more often. And so the idea of punishment and discipline's interesting. So I got two questions to start. First off, if you've got the two and you want to draw a line, so you might as well define the two. But my next question that I kind of want you to go into is whose job is it for each?
So,
So start with discipline.
I think in asking this question, the reason is because we tend to use discipline and punishment synonymously. Like, oh, I need to go discipline my children. I need to punish my children. You put switch the words around. But discipline has a broader usage as we think about disciplining, as in building those good habits. Punishment is a correction, a restoring of the moral order. We talk about the sense of punishment, when we have crimes and somebody pays their debt to society and we want to punish the offender. There's a sense of, that it is this correction. But discipline, when we talk about building discipline, I think that's why I want to draw the line there, because there's a sense in which when we're wanting to do both of these things, that we need to punish when something goes wrong, but we also want to build these disciplines. And I think it's important for us to draw these lines too, because I think sometimes I felt this way as a child, that when I was being forced to build discipline, I felt like I was being punished. And so I think this is why we need to, in some ways, separate these ideas maybe a little bit better, so that way, as we're not just raising our children, but there's a sense even in our own lives, there's a sense of recognizing when we should be punished for wrong that we've done, that we have a debt we owe, but also the idea of building that discipline, those habits in our lives, so that way you don't break the moral order and you need that punishment. So that's
So is
kind of what
punishment a tool of discipline then?
it can be, in a sense, because that's the whole idea. Like, when, and again, without going to different theories of justice, one of the ideas within our civil society is that the reason why we have fines, and the reason why we have jail, and the reason why we have the various, even community service, as we have in the States, is that you're trying to correct the person. You're trying to, in that sense, whether if in
It's
criminal
the idea of
system,
rehabilitation, right?
yeah, rehabilitation. You're trying to, but not just rehabilitate. There's a sense you're punishing, so that way, in the way some of the older movies portray it, you see the error of your ways. You understand that you're getting what you deserve. I even think I saw recently there's been floating around this story of a guy in Japan who, he had done something wrong and he served his sentence, and he didn't believe that he had been punished enough, so he built himself his own jail cell, like in his home, like because he felt, in the sense, he still had to pay for this. So now, when we think about in our families, this is why we're asking this question too: why do we punish versus why do we discipline? Because I think it's also important for parents to hear that punishment is not to make the parent feel better. That is like a vindictiveness
Yeah.
that comes into it. And I think this is why, we need to ask these questions. Why are we punishing? Why are we disciplining? What's our goals? So that way we can actually achieve these things and have it not become something else.
So let's make sure we stick to our roots here. Uh, so justice would be the virtue that this all falls under.
Correct.
So can you define the virtue of justice?
So justice is giving to another what is owed.
So discipline and punishment would easily fall under those. Whose job, or maybe it's not even job, because job is easy, because that would be a responsibility. Yeah, but I guess that is a question. Whose responsibility then is it, since we're talking about children, and actually you extended it to everyone, whose responsibility and job is it for discipline and punishment?
Well, children, I would say immediately to be the parents, both father and mother.
Solely?
No, but I mean, I think that primarily, yes, especially the younger children, they're going to be. And when you're even when you go out in public, if you have your children and they're running wild, you kind of it's a bad reflection on the parents. So people would see them like they're not being disciplined; they ought to be punished or whatever because of the way they're talking or whatever. Um, yeah, I think that I think primarily early on. I mean,
But those people on the street don't have the authority or the right to
yeah,
punish those children that are
yeah,
that are
they
running
can point
around.
they can point out those things, but the parents would be the ones that would have the authority, yeah, to punish because it's their responsibility as parents to do those things.
Okay.
Well,
You gonna co-sign that one?
well, I think it's the idea when you're dealing with punishment and correction, it's whoever has that authority. So that's why
So who ought to have that authority?
as it relates with most immediate, and that's what Thomas was talking about, the parents are going to be the most immediate. But then as we look at the larger church family, as we look at elders, we look at pastors, we look at this is why even in society that those who have authority, when we think of like police officers or we think of teachers, we think of the
Yep,
principal in the school, these are all people who have the authority to punish, and and that authority extends to various degrees. And that's
Sure.
why I think in terms of dealing out punishment, some are much more exclusive for that, kind of like in the case of we think of police officers, like that's kind of why they're there. They're they're the ones who are going to catch the person doing the crime. They're the ones who are going to do this. They're not there more for the discipline aspect, to actually in terms of helping the person become better, helping not just from an aspect of justice. This is why I think discipline goes deeper and further than just punishment. Punishment is going to be under absolutely the aspect of justice, but discipline is going to bring in all those other factors like self control. Like if you don't have the discipline, the personal discipline of self control, that's going to be the reason why you're going to do the things that are going to bring punishment
So
upon you.
disciplining is building the
mhm,
character, building the habits, building the the aspects of virtue. So the reason I asked the question is who ought to, because I feel like in our society it has gotten incredibly disordered, the
mhm,
question I just asked.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm in my mid 40s. I absolutely got spanked by a paddle from my principal when I was in second grade. He called my mom. He had to get permission. My mom's like, if you think he deserves it, go to town. And that punishment was doled out by him. Today's society, if somebody were to try to discipline somebody else's child in a school like that, it would be on the news and that person would end up in jail. In the church, being a pastor, I am cautious about getting after someone's kid because I know how sensitive of a
mhm.
subject that can be.
Hmm.
So the reason I asked the question is because I've gotten to the point I think that in our society it's become completely disordered in that we only think it's the parents who have the right to and authority to and responsibility to. But the reality is when you said church family, at a minimum, there should be more, but we don't grant that authority out, even though it should be there?
Right. And I think this is why I'm also bringing this up is because I think, particularly, this is what I saw when I was working in the school system. I think the school seeks to discipline children, as in, offer the corrective mindset, but the schools do not punish at all. They will actually, we weren't allowed to even use that vocabulary. Like
Yeah,
we did not punish children. We would only, in this sense, correct them. We would try to, or what they talk about redirecting. It's all just
yeah.
redirecting.
They can't even use the word consequence. I actually had a conversation with a teacher at my daughter's school, and in her classroom, she said that she doesn't use the word punishment, she doesn't use the word discipline, nor does she use the word consequence.
Well,
Like,
she doesn't versus she can't. Those are 2 different
well, she
things.
she doesn't.
Okay.
Because because I was upset. I'm like, how do you? Because that's what you're doing when you're trying to redirect. You're trying, you're disciplining in some sense, but you just don't want to use those words and terminology.
Well, there's a difference. I mean, there's parents like me, it sounds like you, who want
Yeah,
that done, but it seems as if most of our society doesn't want anyone to do that.
but
I think in the military, one of the in the military, it was the idea of I have all of the responsibility, yet none of the authority. So I have the responsibility for the discipline, but none of the authority to
yeah,
enact the discipline through punishment I deem necessary. So we've done this to our teachers. We've given them all of the responsibility, basically, because we've outsourced the raising of our children
yeah,
to them, but we've yet granted them no authority to follow through. And we do the same thing in churches.
yep,
We send them down to the care workers and we say, here's all the responsibility. Form my child 1 hour a week, yet no authority to actually enact
because
anything to do it.
well,
So that's why I asked the question: is who ought should we the idea? It should be more than the parents.
absolutely. I think it's primarily with the parents because that's the primary source. But the kids should learn from the parents how to mind themselves in different environments, especially the classroom. My wife was a assistant principal at a Christian school for a few years, and I would listen to some of the conversations, and and a lot of times with my wife, the parents are protecting their kid's sin. It's clear sin, the kid's wrong, and no matter like what, they're instead of them taking the principal or the teacher's side and being like, all right, we're gonna fix this problem, which I mean ultimately stems to some sin that the kid's committing if you're especially going from a Christian school and they signed, that they're gonna to adhere to these rules and we're disciplining your child based upon him or her breaking these rules, and then the parents are coming in there screaming and yelling, protecting their kid from like, in their sin, keeping them, and now the kid's now emboldened in that sin because mom and dad are going to pack me up and I can just continue this. It's like reinforcing that negative behavior. And that's kind of what like a lot of what she had to deal with. And we're like, what do we do with these kids? They don't even care if they get in trouble. They don't care about anything because no one's at home following up.
Right.
And so in asking these questions, this is why, as we look at this and what you're getting at, Nick, is that when we need both, and my whole point for asking this, we need both of these things. We need to understand
Mhm.
punishment as the restoring of the correcting the moral order in that sense, and the discipline is again when I'm disciplining, and I think of we talk about the spiritual disciplines. We talk about doing the kinds of things that build those good habits. So we need both of these in the home, but I think where you're hitting, Nick, is particularly we also from the side of the church that when these things are going on in the church, when these things are happening, there are older men and women who, whether they're pastors, whether they're deacons, whether they're just lay members of part of the church family, there is a sense in which we need to partake in this where we have that kind of authority, where we're able to speak and do these things in the lives of children, and where parents in many ways should, I think this is what Thomas was getting at, they don't embrace the idea of another adult punishing their child
Nobody's going to tell me how to
or
raise my kid.
Yeah.
yeah, or disciplining their child. And I think it's sometimes it falls back from a sense of shame on the parent, like, oh, this is just my job.
Well, this is perfect. So I'm going to read the scripture on which flows with today's conversation, and it's Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. And the reason I asked that question before I read the verse is I think every time we think about this scripture, it's always this is parenting, but is this strictly directed to just the parents?
And like I said, I think it's a larger community that's involved there. And I think,
Do I bear a responsibility if your kid's a knucklehead?
well, I think there's an element that when you're involved or when it's in your domain, you have that right to speak into that, which we've actually done that before because my oldest was a knucklehead in church one time. And we had to get you involved, and he had, I think it was good to have other people speak into his life, but also when other people bring that punishment, that sense of this is an act of love.
Mm-hmm.
This is an act for their good. and it's for the good of, in the case of when you're punishing, there's also a sense, and in his case there wasn't really like another victim so much, he was just being selfish.
Just a
So
knucklehead.
yeah, but when someone else has been offended, to have other people show that love, to say, I love the victim, you know, with whatever's happened, but also to love the offender, that I'm going to honor your decision, that I'm going to hold you accountable, but it's not just left there. And I think this is why that idea of discipline, in terms of disciplining for future good behavior and not just bringing that punishment, that's why I want to draw that line. And even if it's just two sides of a coin, I think that by leaving out one or the other, we're doing an injustice to our children. We're doing an injustice by either just, if punishment is all they know and never the discipline and the correction,
Hmm.
there's a sense they can't get better. And if all we focus on is the discipline but never the punishment, we've never really held them accountable. And I think, again, not just from the side of the parents, I think there needs to be that sense when, I don't like it when other people get onto my kids, but there's
No,
a sense that,
nobody likes it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I
yeah,
want to smack somebody in their mouth, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't get on my kids anyway.
right. But I think that there's,
Sorry, I'm not supposed to talk like that.
I
I
know.
mean, sorry, that was the real Nick.
I know.
That's who I am. I
That's the
apologize.
other
I
side.
actually don't apologize. That's just who I am.
well, I mean, again, well, that there's that sense. Sometimes we feel that way. Sometimes we go. I think this speaks to Thomas's point. What happens with parents and teachers sometimes, that the parents have this natural reaction to defend their child. They become protective. The defenses go up. So I want to recognize that is a natural reaction, but it's something we have to curb. That's
Yep.
something we have to look and say, wait a minute, I don't like the way this feels, but my child needs this.
Mm,
My child will benefit from this.
right.
And though it might make me lose face, which I think is some of the concern too, is like,
It's
oh,
a pride.
my child doesn't do anything wrong. Well,
My
yeah,
child
they
would
do.
never do that.
Right. To admit, yeah, my child
I
did
got
do
child
this.
your video. I got video of your child doing it.
Right. So,
And another thing that from my experience with my children, when they feel guilty, like, even you think about Adam and Eve in the garden, like when they felt guilty, when hid, like it's almost like they have this weight on them. I remember my son used to, like, you could just, when he had a bad day at school, you could just see it on his face. And almost the punishment is a relief. Like they finally can, like we can go through the, like, you want to avoid punishment, avoid punishment, avoid punishment. Parents don't want to punish their kids, but that's actually in some sense like a loving thing to do, relieves them of that burden. Like you rectified your wrong, you've been punished, you've got grounded, or you got whatever. And when they actually accept that, and be like, okay, if they actually do accept that, not blame somebody else, they actually find they benefit from them. Now that weight's lifted off them, the relationship between, this is my kids, like
So
when
you're
they're,
saying it's a type of penance.
yeah, it's kind of like, it helps alleviate that burden of that guilt when they're trying to hide that from your parents. And I know from being around my children when they're feeling that. So you have to go, and I actually have to enact. I have to follow through with the discipline, and or the punishment that I put out there. Like they lose stuff, they get whatever.
I don't know. My mom must have been better at punishment because it never made me feel good. So
Well, I mean, I'm not saying, like, if you legitimately are guilty over your sin, and we talked about that before, about mourning being like, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The idea of like, like they're mourning over their sin, and they're actually feeling guilty, and they look at their father, and they're like, I don't want to disappoint him, and so then you can give them what you're gonna discipline them, you're going to punish them, but then you're also going to come, and that relationship will grow. You brace them. That's what I always did. If I didn't do a punishment, I did it with I wasn't through emotions. I try to, like, keep those aside, and doing it because it's what I need to do. But then
well,
afterward,
I'm not. That's something you had said earlier. Is that you don't we don't punish our kids to make us feel better.
Yeah,
And I know there are some parents that
yeah,
do
because if
that.
you're emotional and you're just angry, and it doesn't.
So the punishment is for what? What is
It's
specifically is a punishment
I
for?
the way I understood, like, this is just, I mean, speaking from my experience, is to get their attention. They're heading into the wrong direction,
I
and
mean, I can yell and get their attention.
but I mean, really getting their attention, really, like, you can yell, then that eventually they get used to that. If that's all you're doing, like, yelling becomes so, like, it just becomes a habit. They're used to it. But actually punishing them and then having them look eye to eye and explaining what they did wrong. Now that, because the punishment's supposed to get their attention, and then discipline would be you explaining to them what they did wrong and why you had to do what you had to do, and that I love you, and that's why I had to do this, because I care more about you becoming a good person than just allowing you just to, you know.
Is that what you would call punishment?
So the punishment is the restoring of, like I've said before, the restoring of that moral order. That this is why the punishment must fit the crime.
Mm.
So that's why
So a balancing of scales.
it is, in a sense, the balancing of scales, which is why it's what's owed to them. Because if we don't, if all we do, for example, is yell, because I think some parents will kind of default to that, and that does not fit the crime, then an injustice has been done. You
Yeah.
have not given them what they've deserved. If the punishment goes well beyond what they deserve, again, that's another
It's a
injustice.
child abuse at that point.
So yeah, you've got to match the punishment to the crime. There's a sense in restoring that order, you're showing them this is cause and effect,
Mhm.
but then that idea of the discipline afterwards is from a stance of, okay, how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen
Yeah.
again?
Sure.
And that's why that discipline that comes afterwards, like, again, if the punishment, I'm just going to make up something, like if my son does something and, like, okay, you're gonna, the punishment is you're grounded, and he serves his grounding, the discipline will follow that. Okay, how are we going to make sure this thing does not happen again? And now I'm going to go into things that might be harder or that I wouldn't done before, but that's because he's broken this
Yeah.
order. And my discipline is not punishment. I'm not continuing to punish him, but the discipline might be the direct result of his actions, and that is to help bring about that good.
So
And that's why
what's your most creative punishment? Quick.
my most creative punishment.
Sure.
And going back to what we talked about before, my most creative punishment, I don't like to punish when I'm angry. I don't want to react out of emotion. So the most creative punishment is my kids having to wait and wondering what's going to happen to them
That's good.
as I'm figuring it out. Because when daddy's got a clear head, he can really figure out, he can get creative.
Some good ones.
There is that sense of
Alright.
even just some of that punishment, just the waiting, just the wonder
Yeah.
is enough for them to realize I don't like
silence
this.
and anticipation are definitely a tool. What's
Oh,
your most
absolutely.
creative punishment?
Oh man. Um, I kind of go with what Thomas says. It's the anticipation, like being cool and collected, and allowing them to kind of sit in their room and waiting for, like, especially my wife says, like, Dad's gonna take care of this, and, like, whatever that means, it just scares my kids. And so when I enter the room, I can just, it just has that effect of, yeah, I know this is not just one time, but I've kind of pretty much do the same thing each time, just kind of making sure that they know I'm being serious and I have their attention.
So my most creative punishment was the summer of the stump. Mine's a little different.
Yeah,
Mine's not
you're looking for a
anticipation.
funny story, yeah.
No, not a funny story, just creative punishment.
I
I
remember the summer of the stump.
made one of my kids spend an entire summer with an axe and a shovel to remove a 4 to 5 foot, what's that, 1.5 meter stump in my backyard. And that punishment fit the crime. And so I think as we talk through this, and there was discipline that came throughout that entire summer as I sat there in a chair with a lemonade, disciplining while the working was going on. I tell that not just because it's a funny story, but is that I think there is an element
Yeah.
here where it's not just beating our children, like as some people think that is what this means. Is that there is an element of creativity that goes with this to truly
And all kids are,
get their attention, but
think-
also to balance those scales and
Yeah.
really drive home the character development
Yeah.
that goes along with it.
yep.
Gentlemen, appreciate the conversation. As always, You can find us at familiesofvirtue.com. Our podcast, Virtuous Roots, can be found on all streaming platforms. Thanks for joining us, and God bless.